It's really an absolute enormous pleasure to introduce him now to give a lecture to kind of end this 2 days of events. It's also extraordinarily difficult to introduce him because his work is so extensive, and I think if I try and describe it, I'll be here for far too long. He's Professor of Anthropology and Chair of the Department of Anthropology at Notre Dame. His work spans evolutionary anthropology, primatology and multispecies ethnography. And I suppose it's my entry point into his work was through the latter, the multispecies work. And he's really a pioneer figure in this field of multispecies anthropology and ethnoprimatology. And his work has been a kind of catalyst for new ways of thinking in this field. And he's been at the forefront of integrated approaches in multispecies anthropology. And I think what I find really exciting about his work is his ability to really bring together these distinct fields in quite a unique way, in a way that would challenge certainly me and perhaps most of us in this room. And I think the breadth of his publications evidence his ability to speak to kind of these multiple kinds of audience and these different kinds of scientific languages. His work's been methodologically innovative and has certainly in the field which I'm most familiar with, the part of his work on the multi-species encounters, has been also very theoretically stimulating for me personally and for the discipline in general. So I think that's enough. And I'd like to hand over to him for his talk and say thank you again. It's such a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. Thanks. I really I have to live up to that introduction. I want to thank Hannah and Anne for inviting me and for organizing this, which has been a wonderful workshop and very inspiring, just because there's a bunch of diverse perspectives and ideas together for the past 2 days, thinking aloud about some very complex but actually very urgent topics, and I've really benefited from it. So thank all of you for contributing to my enjoyment of the past 2 days. What I'm going to try to do here today is somewhat epitomized here. The anthropology that I push, the anthropology that I desire is really, we can call it anthropology because it's about humans. But I'm open to broad engagement. I'm not interested in what we call what we do. I'm very interested in the diverse array of methodological toolkits that we can bring to bear on questions that give us better answers. And I think anthropology is a great nexus to do that. Unfortunately, it often results in a beautiful mess like this. But I think there's beauty in hybridity and a little bit of chaos. And I'll come back to why I have this. This is a giraffe humpback whale hybrid. Not a real one, but a photoshopped one that we'll come back to at the end. So what I'd like to do today, and I'll try not to take too long so that we can have some discussion about it, is push sort of 3 themes that are related to, that I think are very related and maybe central to the kind of questions being asked in this workshop. And that is that we haven't really talked that much about. And one of those is sort of deep time and the role of human evolution and the trajectories over that period of the last couple million years that actually influence, I think, and can contribute to the kinds of discussions we have about what humans are doing today. Nothing we do now is completely detached from our histories, so I think those histories are important. And I think there are some toolkits in contemporary evolutionary theory that allow us to think this through and that are open and amenable to a diverse arena of inputs that integrates different anthropological and other approaches. And then I want to give you some examples of how I think this sort of works from some work I and others have done. But to start with, let us situate ourselves in and some people don't like this term, I however do, situate ourselves in the Anthropocene, because for the past 2 days that's what we've been talking about. We have been talking about the Anthropocene. A time where the human imprint on the global environment has become so large and active that it rivals what we would call the great forces of nature, and it's time to name it as that way. We live in a kind of a hybrid Earth, right, where, as Hamilton and Greenwald recently said, nature is injected with human will, however responsibly or irresponsibly that will may have been exercised. There's no way out of it. Humans are major players in the global ecosystem, at micro and macro levels. And I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind. But more importantly, and relevant to this discussion, is that we have never been alone in this process. The idea that humans are ever disconnected from multiple other forms of life is an erroneous one, and I think it's a dangerous one when we actually try to work on some of the complex issues that we see today. So here's an example. Here we have a trash dump, and we have storks, cattle, and humans, and a plethora, if we want to talk about potential pathogen environments. We have a really nice one right here. So we have thousands of microorganisms interacting all in this sort of glorious mess. And this is an extreme example, but I think it's a really important one that shows us the kind of basal complexity that we're dealing with. None of these systems are simple. We try to reduce them to simple solutions, but I think accepting the complexity of the modern ecologies of interest is an important starting point. So let me just give my little push here for an integrative anthropology, and let me draw on a couple individuals to sort of emphasize this idea of what I like to call generous theoretical entanglements. There are many, many, many threads of theory in anthropology and beyond, and I think those threads, while sometimes contradictory or in friction, actually should be put together more often. Let the friction occur and see what might come out. And also, as Hannah already said, I'm very interested in reinserting a multispeciesness in our thinking about the human experience and both being and becoming human. Philippe Descola recently, in a couple different books, reminded us that the social reality of humans are really between humans and other humans and our ecologies. And this is an old maxim that sometimes we forget when we become very caught up in particular aspects. Geertz tells us the same thing. And I think Hugh Raffles, who we mentioned the other day, has a very nice but hard to read notion on this, and I'll read it. The necessity of it, there is a necessity of insisting on the nature cultural concurrently with the extra discourse of materiality that is the really real of both nature in its biophysicality and of the human experience. You have to read it like 8 times to let it sink in. I think that's a lot of Hugh's stuff. The point being is that there's a really real in the biophysical materiality and a really real in the perceptual experience. And the integration of those things is the challenge of anthropology, of the study of humanity. We are, as Donna Haraway argues, nature neutral. I don't like the term that much either, but we're stuck with it. We are not biology and culture. Right? We are always this beautiful, entangled mess. Now, when it comes to humans and other animals, this entanglement takes on a myriad of forms, and they're not clear. Many of them involve a fluidity of boundaries, a sharing of space and place, and an intermingling of bodies and biota. There are many ways in which these entanglements manifest themselves, but the particular histories of, let's say, pathogen sharing are extremely important. But sometimes there are surprises. Okay, here's a young Harari gentleman and a medium-aged Harari hyena. They live together in Ethiopia, in the city of Harar, in an incredible, centuries-old, collaborative use of space. This is not what we usually think about because we have pre-assumptions about what multi-species interfaces look like. We know that the fluidity, the mutual exchange of bodies and fluids and histories is really a central component in many, many, many human societies, mythologically and practically. But we're interested in pathogens, in large part in disease, for the last 2 days. And so we can take something like chlamydia pneumonia, which is a bacteria that causes significant upper respiratory distress and disease in humans, and it, interestingly, at least as far as we can tell now, has its origins in the multifarious interconnections between humans and a variety of other animals. And in different places of the planet, it actually has different animals as its sort of affiliate hosts, along with humans, whether they could be horses, or maybe snakes and iguanas, or even koala bears, depending on where you are on the planet. So there's a kind of fluidity between the boundaries and species here when we think of pathogens in a larger sense than before. So my talk here is an attempt to provide a context context via contribution that draws on the deep interfaces of our evolutionary heritage, a little bit of contemporary evolutionary theory, and very importantly, diverse kinds of ethnographic engagement. And of course, because of the work I do, it's also about monkeys. And to sort of kick us off, I want to point out there are two primates named Fuentes here. This one and this one. Yeah, this is in Gibraltar when he was born. The folks in Gibraltar named the monkeys after the researchers who were there on occasion. And so we have two primates named Fuentes sharing a lot. Not everything, but a lot more maybe than we might assume. All right, so deep histories, entangled ecologies, and emergent complexities. Let me spend a little while before we get into talking about pathogens and primates, as in a sort of an example here, to talk a little bit about niche construction, to talk a little bit about contemporary evolutionary theory that provides a kind of expansion upon the traditional neo-Darwinian perspectives that allows us to really get back to a serious consideration of ecologies and the dynamic of the organism-ecology interface. Now, if we think about human evolution, I have to get some hominin evolution in here somewhere. We haven't talked about it yet at all. We know a lot. We don't know everything, but we know a lot. But for the perspective of this talk, we know that there's been about 6 million years of hominin evolution, of diverse experiments, of failures and successes. But we also know that over that 6 million years, pretty much everything that was not on our specific lineage, that is that cluster in the genus Homo, has gone extinct. So a number of experiments, all of which ultimately we can say fail in regards to the diverse array. And we also know of all the members of the genus Homo, only Homo sapiens, us in our current form, is left. And there were a number of other experiments, including experiments that hybridized with Homo sapiens. Now, you've probably all heard about the late find, the Homo naledi. We can complain or debate about that later. But what's really important here is that we know that there's something distinctive about our species relative even to the other hominids. Now, what is that distinction? Well, to really ask that question, we need to go beyond explaining our bodies and ecologies. We need to develop a theoretical approach that can describe an effective toolkit for an evolving system that facilitated, a model that facilitated a community of beings to move from the production of simple stone tools. Now, no one's ever impressed by these Oldemont tools, right? This is a little over, it's about 1.89 million years old, these tools. They're just sharp rocks. Nothing on the history of this planet has ever been able to do this aside from our lineage. So I just don't want to downplay how important sharp rocks are. So we need to be able to explain how we go from something, that community of individuals that made simple stone tools 2 million years ago, to increasingly complex tools, to widening geographic spread by 1 million years ago, to the use and control of fire, to complex hunting, rudimentary language, to art and complex multi-community social networks, to agriculture, to towns, to megacities, to global religions and world economies of today. That's actually the challenge of human evolution. And it is a challenge to explain this human ability to deploy multiple and distinctive modes of response to evolutionary pressures and their concomitant influence on the ecological landscapes of us and others that facilitated the emergence of this relatively arrogantly named thing we call sapiens by about 100,000 years ago. So the way we construct the narrative of this evolution is central to our ability to understand it. Let me suggest that thinking about niche construction as a major sort of process of evolutionary change will help us. And I am going to get to ecologies and pathogens. And I'm trying to set the stage here. As Kevin Leyland and colleagues remind us, we don't replicate things. Organisms are constructed in development, not simply programmed developed by genes. Living things do not evolve into pre-existing environments, but co-construct and co-evolve with their environments in the process, changing the structure of ecosystems. This is not just humans, this is all things. But humans take a particularly distinctive way of doing this. And thinking about the relationship between humans, other species, and pathogens, this perspective is beneficial. If we think about niche construction, some of the most important components involved in it really are the notion that organisms modify their and other organisms' selective environments. That is, the evolutionary context in which we live is constantly being shaped by the reactions to it. And those reactions cascade, creating kinds of ecological inheritance. changing local ecologies that move down through time, affecting not just ourselves, but all of the organisms within it. For humans, cultural processes, institutions, actions, and perceptions provide a particularly important vehicle for this interface, this mutually mutable interface with our ecologies. So in the traditional evolutionary approach, we tend to think of sort of natural selection affecting gene pools, and then there's sort of inheritance of those changes into the next environmental context with renewed selection pressures on those gene pools. Niche construction just argues that there's a bit of mutability, a bit of feedback between environments and organisms, and that that's an active structuring agent of both the ecology and the organisms. And in humans, it's particularly salient because the ways in which the feedback occurs, the ways in which humans react to being in the world, involves a much more diverse toolkit than it does for many other organisms. Now, we know plenty of organisms niche construct. That's a common pattern, right? Even Darwin described, he realized he was describing niche construction, but he talked about the changes with earthworms, and there's been work on beavers and a variety of other organisms. So many organisms react to the pressures of the world by modifying those pressures, changing their local ecologies, changing the ecologies downstream for members of their own population and other species around them. That is not really a contentious statement. However, humans do it in particularly interesting ways. If we think about something as simple, it's incredibly complex, but as simple as the models we have of, let's say, sickle cell anemia and malarial diversities, or even something like lactase persistence, right? The ability to maintain the enzymatic action that allows you to break down the sugars in milks. They're this hodgepodge, this mix of local ecological, cultural perceptions, and dynamic environmental flexibility based on the actions of human populations that then feed back and alter the genetic structures of the humans and the physiologies that develop there. So there's this kind of interactivity that is quite substantial. If we think about this broad picture of human evolution, Kim Stromley, I think, says this best, that the story of human evolution is really about individuals not so much facing ecological filters in their environment alone, but with others. Humans always work in coordinated, creative, collaborative groups, and with technology, information, and misinformation that their social world provides. Ecological and social complexity over the course of human evolution became fused as the ecological problem of extracting resources as individuals from a world we did not make became the economic problem of extracting resources collectively and in a human world. And there's a number of recent sort of overviews of this. Susan Anton at New York, at NYU, has done a lot of this, and a number of other folks are publishing this, demonstrating this sort of incredible collaborative actions throughout human evolutionary history that have led to things like social traditions, the incredible tool use, manufacture, and trade, the use and expansion of fire, which led to increased infant survivorship, which led to the ability to have a very, very plastic and dynamic physiology, which reduced predator pressure, which increased habitat exploitation, which really increased information transfer via more and more complex patterns, eventually with language emerging, all of which led to this sort of evolving human cognition which facilitated the kind of multifaceted engagement and success with a diverse array of environments. If you look around the planet, there are almost no large multicellular organisms that have the kind of diversity of interface with ecologies that humans do. We're very distinctive for a mammal in that context. So this leads us to today. If you think about that sort of background. We're in a globally connected world, one rich in complexity, interconnectedness, massive manipulation of the biotic and abiotic landscapes, and one in which pathogen landscapes are increasingly complex, central to the human experience, and tangled in a web of multi-species interfaces. If we think of a local ecology like Hong Kong, or a clear-cut zone in the Amazonian or Central African or Indonesian rainforests, or the millions of highly manipulated and modified livestock that we have created and that continue to create us, or the kind of massive landscape alteration associated with the production of entirely new kinds of plants and animals, we get to a better picture and a better understanding of sort of where we are in this broad context. We are in a kind of Anthropocene that is also maybe possible to be considered as a virusine. The age of humans is also becoming the age of the virus because of the way in which we have manipulated the world. The ability to move between bodies has been expanded radically as those bodies themselves have been expanded in the types of engagements. By constructing this radically shifting and changing set of ecologies in a diverse global context, we've created new landscapes and new opportunities specifically for viral and other pathogens. This slide, and this is a reduced one of it, usually just makes people feel really uncomfortable and somewhat ill. And I think it's important to step back and realize that while humans and viruses have millions of years of coevolutionary histories, much of our genome, in fact, is affected by viral interactions, the ways in which we are seeing serious morbidity and mortality from viruses and virus interactions, not just in humans, but in human-affiliated other organisms, has radically increased in the last 10 to 15,000 years, and is increasing at a pace that's even outstripping that more recently. And again, I want to, as a quote from Jeremy actually, I want to point out that it is thinking with contemporary evolutionary theory that doesn't only focus on sort of natural selection between organisms and environment, but actually mutual mutability and the notion of inherited ecologies that sets us up in a way that we can think of sort of evolutionary dynamics in the modern context, not detaching us from our roots, but also not reducing the kinds of potential complexity in these relationships. All right, let me give you 3 examples, and then we can talk about some monkeys and things like that. One has nothing to do with pathogens, but it will, I hope, force you a little bit to consider how early and how massive humans have modified the globe. This is the Messac Setafet. It's a sandstone massif in the Central Sahara in Libya. And if you go there today, what you see is sort of this. If you were there about 100,000 years ago, 150,000 years ago, it's actually a bit lusher, but the landscape, this sort of litter of rocks, was still there. The outcrops are incredible. The sandstone and other outcrops are incredibly common there. And if you take a very close look, which you probably can't see, but a huge percentage of this ground cover is actually worked stone tools. In fact, in surveys of this area, you can demonstrate that in some areas there are as many as 75 lithics, 75 stone tools or stone tool debitage per square meter in this area, in an area that covers multiple kilometers. This is an area that has tens of thousands of years of recurrent use by humans that created a novel landscape 100,000 years ago. And I tell you, this is nothing compared to what we do on a daily basis today. So I think the notion that it's all recent is incorrect. Humans have a deep, deep and successful history of manipulating the world around them and being then shaped by that manipulation. It's just we're much better at doing it at a much higher volume and a much faster pace. One of the first areas that we have good evidence for of shaping others are, of course, dogs. So work by Reed and others looking in northern Europe shows something really interesting about 9 to 14,000 years ago. We know in these areas that the history of herding of reindeer is quite old. Probably the earliest evidence for domestic reindeer is about 9,000, 8,900 years ago. But we have some interesting evidence of serial migrations, waves of different peoples into this area. It isn't when we see about 12,000 years ago, one group of peoples coming in with dogs, that all of a sudden we see a shift in the reindeer. We see a change in that pattern. So by 10 to 12,000 years ago, humans and dogs were already collaborating to reshape other organisms and to reshape landscapes. But some people, like Pat Shipman, have argued it goes much deeper than that. If you look at the 6 well-documented mammoth kill sites in Western Europe that are in the late Paleolithic, 15 to almost 32,000 years ago, you find that the ones with high degrees of large mammoth kills are associated with dog, and those that have no mammoth kills are not. What does that mean? Who knows? It's a small animal, but it is indicative of something. And we know that by 12,000 years ago, this is a beautiful picture of a burial at Uyun al-Haman in today what is Jordan. Actually, this is Ain Malala in Israel, where we see a young woman and a young dog buried together. And in the Natufian culture in this region, between about 8 and 14,000 years ago, this burial of humans and dogs and humans and foxes is actually quite common. So I can't help but wondering whether the process of domesticating dogs was connected to changes in human anatomy and communication abilities and cognitive infrastructure. Domestication is a two-way street, as we well know from many examples. And it is shortly after this time period that we get the litany of domestication stories. Between about 10 to 12,000 years ago and about 4,000 years ago, a number of species are highly modified, shaped, reshaped, and begin to shape us. For example, dogs, cats, chickens, cows, horses, pigeons, hamsters, guinea pigs, rats, pigs, goats, sheep, llamas, alpacas, water buffalo, ducks, geese, rabbits, turkeys, salmon, tuna, tilapia, apples, oranges, papaya, mangoes, plums, tomatoes, carrots, bananas, rice, beans, wheat, hops, potatoes, sweet potatoes, yams, onions, beets, leeks, lettuce, cabbage, peaches, etc., etc. Almost everything that we think of as the natural world that surrounds us on a daily basis has been shaped by human action over millennia and is shaping our bodies and our perceptions and our behaviors. So the domestication process is incredibly important. But what's very interesting is if you go in deep in our time frame and look at this process, it didn't look very good early on. In fact, almost all the early domestic communities we had between about 7,000 and 10,000 years ago look like their health is getting worse. It is also the first time that we see clear evidence of infectious disease in the skeletal remains of human populations. And that evidence increases. So the advent of agriculture and animal domestication actually caused a decrease in health initially, but an increase in reproductive output, and an increase in the landscape for pathogen exchange. Moving in, co-living, co-residing, bringing into our families multiple other species, consuming them, feeding them, raising them, caring for them, developed a kind of fluidity, a kind of ecology that is extremely beneficial to microbial and viral pathogen exchange. But we tend to think of domestication only in this context of the stuff that we manipulate for our food. Let me step back and go back to a city again, because there are many, many species that coexist only in our urban landscapes. You will not find pigeons in the wild, because the wild is New York or London or Chicago or where have you. They live in human urban environments, and we and they co-shape those environments. Coyotes in North America have become wildly successful of late, not because of the large open rangelands, but because of their ability to live inside and around human urban environments. Fruit bats in Sydney, deer, this is actually North London. Monkeys, which we'll get to in a moment. Here's monkeys in Hong Kong. I recently completed a large-scale project in Singapore, which is one of the most dense places on the planet. There are thousands of monkeys in Singapore. And civets. Can't forget the civets. There are actually many, 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 many civets as well, co-living with humans in these environments. Raccoons, one of my favorite, incredibly adaptable. And of course, as we heard earlier today, rats. People really do not give Rattus norvegicus the credit that they deserve. Because this is the only other species that has been able to globally dominate in the way we have. So becoming human is a multi-species endeavor. Okay? So when we think about human evolutionary processes, placing in this broad context of a kind of mutual mutability between humans and their environments, a co-shaping between us, ecologies, and others, allows us to sort of situate and to root our questions about today in an ongoing process, connecting it to themes, to trajectories, to patterns, rather than just trying to take an immediate slice of time right now. Histories matter. Okay, so what about primates? I, for the last 25 years, been working with humans and other primates. And one of the things that I came to, because I was forced to, was the fact that humans and other primates share much more complex interfaces than I had known. When I went out to do my dissertation, I went to some very, very remote area where there are no humans, where there are lots of primates, right? Or at least I thought that was the case. Turns out that wasn't the case there. Humans share a diverse social, ecological, symbolic, and conflictual, sometimes even hopeful, context of relationships with other primates. And I just want to point out the distribution of non-human primates, and notice that it overlaps with much of what we call the Global South, and is part of the developing economies, biologies, ecologies of the globe. And when from a pathogen context, that becomes extremely important because we are primates, and there is the potential for a particular kind of pathogen sharing environments that that individuals from the same group of mammals have. All right. So most people, went up until the last decade or so, when talking about non-human primates and humans, would talk about the conflict, the competition, about hunting, and about food, about pets, and about pestilence. There was always this notion of conflict, this kind of conflict engagement. And there is a lot of conflict. All of these things are true, but they, in no means, are the entire picture. When you actually go out and look at the relationships between humans and other primates, you see a huge range of interesting things, including the fact that anthropogenic ecologies are normative ecosystems for many, if not most, non-human primates. That is, most primates actually coexist in heavily modified habitats. Co-evolutionary histories, that is, if you look at the modern distribution of a lot of primates, those distributions, and I will argue momentarily, the genetic structure of many of those populations have been heavily influenced by human action. We actually shape the population genetics and ecological interfaces of each other, and of course, pathogens become very important because of cooperating village life, urban monkeys, a variety of other things. And I'm not going to talk much about it, but I'd also like to point out that in many societies, primates form a very important part of the human social fabric, of our mythos, of the way in which we describe ourselves, our ancestries, where we are going, and our role in relation. Primates are often mediators between humans and other components of their ecologies. The diversity of interfaces, close physical, emotional interfaces between humans and other primates is absolutely amazing. Here's the Badayu of Bangladesh, who share an origin with the Rami of Europe and the Middle East. These are wanderer peoples who have a millennia old, centuries old that we can document, but probably millennia old according to them, relationship between performing animals, and monkeys are the most common ones. Very, very interestingly, and I'm not going to go into detail because this hasn't been published yet, but work by our team, and specifically Lisa Jones-Engel, has demonstrated that these Badayu also seem to be resistant to certain viral pathogens that other humans are quite susceptible to in high contact environments. We can see throughout South Asia multiple examples of a couple young primates hanging out, eating, right? This one just happens to be Homo sapiens, and that's macaque mulata. We see economic collaborations, and most people would think of this because of the power differential. This is a pigtail macaque in Thailand. That's his human owner, and the pigtails actually collect coconuts for those humans, and they live with the humans. They take them as small, young individuals, and for about 5 years, they train them and have them as sort of economic affiliates to the family. They live in the house with the family, they eat with the family, and they're actually very much cared for, and they can provide, one macaque is equal to about 5 humans in their economic return as far as coconut picking. When they get about 7 or 8 years of age, they're usually released back into the forest if they haven't died. We also have co-urban macaques in a number of different kinds of primates, but largely macaques. Here's a picture from a city in Thailand where most people would not be surprised at all to see pigeons wandering around here, but in many cases macaques do as well. And I just wanted to point out sort of this close connection of 2 different primate species known to harbor pathogens that are harmful to each other, and garbage and tight living quarters. few examples of that, for example, here is Hong Kong. These are the hybrid rhesus macaques. The rhesus macaques of Hong Kong, at least genetically, reflect 3 different species. They're primarily rhesus, but there's some arctoides and some fascicularis also in there, even though they all look more or less like rhesus. And this road here is actually very close to the building that was quarantined for the SARS outbreak. And in fact, there are pictures that they don't publish anymore of macaques on that building, hanging out at the windows. What does that mean? I don't know. But it is something that is quite interesting. But then if you go to the Amazonian region and look at the diverse array of overlaps, the intensive relationships between humans and other primates, you find incredible closeness, and even in some groups, the inclusion of non-human primates in their kinship networks. They're fed, they're worn, they become part of the kinship structure. But the cross-species pathogen transmission is minimal compared to that in Asia. We also, of course, know of some of the very famous instances of this sort of interface as it relates to pathogens in sub-Saharan Africa. Of course, the SIV-HIV connection, and most recently, of course, this Ebola epidemic. I do want to point one thing out here. This is an overview publication of sort of all the more recent the Ebola epidemic outbreaks that we know of, and morbidity and mortality. And other things, but I want to point out a problem here, which is a whole other discussion, but we brought it up a little bit in the last part of the workshop, and that is almost all except for one of these outbreaks are in sub-Saharan Africa, and they have a white guy in the picture. And this says a lot about when we're thinking about who's investing in what and what kind of sort of attitudes are taken to what's really at risk in these contexts. I couldn't resist pointing that out because we're showing this and we're lecturing in a class, and it occurred to me there's something really wrong about this, and it took me a while to figure out what it was. But the point here being is that we also know that the great apes are highly susceptible to Ebola, and in fact, right now, even though the tragedy that has hit the human populations in West Africa is probably tenfold that for gorillas. The population numbers are incredibly reduced. Some people are arguing it's as much as 80% in some areas. And the whole landscape of the Western gorilla population distribution has been impacted severely by this epidemic. And if you listen to the sort of narratives that have been told, they're associated with sort of this danger of primates and the sort of bushmeat and a variety of other things, which is a lot of it is actually erroneous, and a lot of it is this constructed narrative of what the relationships are between humans and the great apes. Ignoring sort of geopolitics, the large investment by health groups, the notion, the relationship, the economic and political infrastructures of bushmeat, not just the bushmeat itself, and of course many other species. And primary amongst those species, of course, being fruit bats and their important role. But the CDC, don't worry, the CDC puts out a nice overview of exactly what's going on, back to arrows and the things, and this is an exemplar of how depauperate the even sort of very important interface is in an area where there's assumed by this sort of biomedical approach that the interface is important. So here we see pretty much the poor humans are suffering from all of these animals' sort of imposition of these viral loads. And in one sense, part of this is true, but so is this. There's mutual mutability in these ecologies. Co-infection and co-influence, and the fact that the official statement does not have the human massive impact on local ecosystems and bodies of other organisms means that this interface is being treated as all about us. And remember the beginning here, we've never done this alone. To talk about humans without thinking about the multi-species context, or to only talk about unidirectional ecological and social and pathological engagement is problematic, to say the least. And we know this from a huge array of different primate species. We've already heard a little bit about malaria, but that's a very important thing because humans and macaques have been sharing malarias for a long time. And in fact, everyone's favorite, right, the 5th human malaria that if you want funding now in Southeast Asia, study transmission of nulci, because that's where everyone is terrified. It's the new, it's going to break out, it's all over. If you actually go back and look at the samples, and what they're not doing is really should go back at all these ones that we call Plasmodium malariae, a lot of those samples with better testing might be showing nulci. And if you look at the recently published sort of genetic analysis of Molesii in both human and macaque populations, it's pushing that origin way back, which makes sense. We have been sharing viruses and bacteria and a variety of other things with primates for a long time. Simian foamy virus is another, I think, really interesting one. This is a retrovirus that functions actually very similar in its transmission properties to HIV and SIV, but in fact is non-pathological in both primates, in both humans and macaques. But we are able to study its transmission and find that those humans that work most closely with the macaques, or that have pets, or that have performing monkeys, are the ones that are highest risk for the simian foamy virus. So there's something that's about not just being bitten because the saliva is the transmission route usually here, but it's about this close, intimate contact for prolonged periods, as we know this with many other species. But what's very interesting, and as I mentioned before, these certain human groups that have deep roots with these primates don't seem to have that. They have some way, there is something going on that gives them a kind of relative immunity. And I say relative because we don't know that it is an immunity. It's just not being transferred. And it's not because they're not getting bit or peed upon and licked by these monkeys, because they are. So there's a lot of, I think, very, very interesting things. And one of the areas that we don't talk too much about, and I use measles as an example here, is measles are not endemic in many primate species. However, many primates can suffer from measles. And in fact, globally, we find that many, many primate populations are in fact infected with measles. And a lot of that has to do with humans. And we're also now realizing that some of the pneumonias and a few other of the, in particular rhinoviruses, also make that jump very easily from humans to other primates. So this is mutual mutability, this back and forth, this bidirectional exchange. It's much more interesting and actually tells us more about the actual ecology of these systems than does the sort of unidirectional motif. So let me sort of wrap this up with an example of some of our work, and just to push why I think anthropology is critical to this entire endeavor. So for many years, I collaborated with University of Notre Dame in Bali to sort of look at the complex ecology of the Bali macaques, Macaca fascicularis, long-tailed macaques that live on Bali. Bali has about 3.5 million humans and probably about 12 to 20,000 long-tailed macaques, and they have a very interesting relationship. The landscape of Bali has been shaped over the last about 1,400 years by two major human forces. One is the materiality of the agricultural system, which is a wet rice agriculture, and the other is the social and perceptual reality of Balinese Hinduism, which is tied into the construction of temples, which are related to the construction of the agricultural system. So the landscape is alive, perceptually and materially infused with the Balinese view of the world. And that mandates particular patterns of temple structure, which shapes the local environment beyond just the agricultural context. It actually shapes the forested and plant community environments as well. And so if you take a look at Bali writ large, and here's just a very, very simple version of this very complex geospatial mapping that we've done, you can see something very interesting. So the yellow is wet rice agriculture, the green is forested areas, and the red is our villages and cities, and then you can see the roads and the 258 rivers in this system. Now, stare at that closely, and you can see there's obviously a high correlation between superhuman density, right? The density here is about 1,400 people per square kilometer, and the rice agriculture and the towns. And then you have this nice, very nice sort of national park area up here, and then a lot of mountainous forested areas there. And we also know that there are 64, at least, that we've observed different populations of macaques, 42 of which we've done sort of long-term, at least more than 2 or 3 years of sort of monitoring. And they're all here. Now, let me just show you these two things. All of the macaques live in and around the high-density human environments, and you can't find them in the forest. There are a few groups in the forest, and those in the forest, as recent work by Fanny Brockhorn has demonstrated, they actually move, they only use the part of the forest near human settlements. They selectively choose to be around humans. And it's because of the relationship between Bali macaques and humans. Part of that relationship involves intensive close interaction, not just between Balinese and macaques, A lot of our work has shown overlap in water use, overlap in space use, overlap in food choice, and particularly at many sites in Bali, overlap in residence at temples, Hindu temples. So there's a kind of shared perceptual landscape and material landscape between them. But Bali's also receives, on good years, 2 to 6 million tourists who hop off in Bali, go hang out with some monkeys on their head, which I still don't understand why everyone wants to have a monkey on them. Monkeys' feet and hands are covered with urine and feces pretty much all the time. But people love it. And so there's this mutual sort of very close physical interaction between these two species. But these representatives of this species are going to hop on a plane and fly 12,000 miles. So there's a very interesting pathogen landscape that we're just trying to model and understand right now. We know the other direction of it, and I'm not going to talk about the human direction, I'm going to talk about the human to, not talk about the macaque to human direction, I'm going to just briefly mention the human to macaque direction, and that is the landscape, and we'll take one temple, Padang Tegal Ubud, which is one of the most famous monkey forests. We've done a lot of work there over the last decade and a half, and then collaborating with Bruce Wheatley and Fanny Barakhorn, we have almost 25 years of demographic and ecological data there, and we know that there's been a huge manipulation of the local ecology by humans of the towns and also by the macaques in the way in which they sort of negotiate their interface with the humans. And there's an interesting byproduct that we've now seen. We have multiple years of demographic data. Not all of it is very good. That is, there are breaks in there, but we have a number of population data here. And there are two things that I want to point out here. There's the monkey population since 1986 has radically increased. We've gone from about 80 individuals to, at the height in 2011, about 612 individuals. And that is due to collaboration between scientists and local Balinese management and temple staff. We came up with the ideal thing from the scientific perspective. What should we do to sort of make this a great management scenario? And it worked. There are now 600-something monkeys, which is not what we envisioned at all. But it is a very interesting feedback, and that's for a whole other story in this sort of relationship. But what I want to point out is that this, right here and right here, are very interesting things where we had massive mortality events. You don't see it as large here, but this is about an 86 individual death here, and we know that right here we had about a 25% mortality of the entire population. Both of these events are connected with an outbreak of Streptococcus. Streptococcus species indeterminate. It looks like it's Suis, a pig Streptococcus, but it's not 100% clear. It's a little funky. What's really interesting is there are no pigs or pig farms. The Balinese have small pig farms, not sort of very large ones, in this area. But there are, of course, rivers, and there are, of course, broad human connection. And what we are noticing now, and we are looking back in the 70s as well, it almost looks as if on a decade or so basis, we tend to get crashes in this population and in a few of the other Bali temple monkey populations. And they seem to be associated with respiratory infections, TB, which has happened at 2 different sites, or streptococcal infections. And these are sort of contexts that are part of the human ecology. So when we look at this relationship between macaques and humans in Bali, I first went to look specifically at macaque ecology and behavior. I actually was not originally, back in the 90s, asking questions about people. But I got to Bali, and I looked at the monkeys and realized that it was incomplete. So 20-something years later, where are we with our basic, simple model of understanding the monkeys, the macaque ecology? Well, it looks something like this. These macaques are enmeshed, entangled, embedded in a mutual relationship that is wholly structured by Balinese action, behavior, perception, as it is connected to the global economy. You should see, we can document shifts in feeding behavior in macaques with changing coconut oil prices and tourist densities because of the provisioning patterns that impact the Balinese, because of the changing seasonality of tourism. So for example, with the major and horrendous events of bombing in Bali, we saw behavioral shifts and decreases in health in at least 3 of the major macaque temple tourism sites. So anyways, this is an incredibly complex relationship, and recently we've been looking at population genetics, parasites, and shared viral entanglements. We've only published a little bit of this so far, but what we're finding is that what it looks like, what the population genetics of island-wide patterns of population genetics in the Bali macaques do not look like the models predict. They in fact look like they've been shaped by the human engagement. And that the parasite sharing is quite intensive, and right now we're looking at multiple species of gastrointestinal parasites, which ones you'd expect that would be shared. And we've published on the SFV, and we're looking intensively at STLV, HTV, and a few others. So I guess the punchline for this human-macaque connection in Bali is to sort of bring this back to the beginning of the talk and to say, humans have these myriad, multifarious, complex engagements with themselves and other species and their ecologies, and they're dynamic and ongoing, and they reflect a deep history of human manipulation of the world as it manipulates us. We are shaping the world, and it in turn is shaping us, and this is a multi-species endeavor. So including all of that process into our analysis of pathogen exchange, I think, is incredibly important. And I'll end with two things. One, a short story. So this is an adult male macaque. This is an adult female human. This is at a site called Bukit Gumam in southeastern Bali. And this male, since he was about 3 years of age, he's about 7 in this picture. Since he's about 3 years of age, his group lives on this big hill where there's a temple. It's about maybe 900 meters from here. This woman owns this little warung, this little sort of stall on the side of a road, and on the other side of this road is a large plantation. So every day, these macaques, the macaque group, about 90 of them, come down to move into the plantation to feed, and then before they go back up to the security of the temple. And this woman, as she tells it, when he was about 3 or so, he just sort of came by, broke off from the group, and came over and snatched some peanuts from her. So after a while, she started giving him them. And then for the last four years, when this photo was taken, every day, every morning, the group comes down, they move across the road, he comes over to her, and they sit, and they spend about 15 minutes hanging out together. She offers him some peanuts, he leans against her, he'll groom her a little bit, she'll groom him, and then he goes his own way. Storytelling is powerful. This is an anecdote, but it reflects the diversity of kinds of engagements that humans have with other primates. And I think it's important to remember that the conflicts, the damages, the horrendous sort of extinction events that are looming in front of us are ever present, but they're also hopeful engagements and kinds of complex, really interesting narratives that we can draw on to think about this larger pattern of interfaces. So, I mean, humans shape and are shaped by our profound immersion in multispecies. When thinking about our deep histories and entangled ecologies, if we meld them with diverse toolkits, then we get a much better baseline with which to ask questions about emergent diseases and pathogen complexities of today. To only think about today via today's lens robs us of an important infrastructure and important basic patterns of understanding what ecology is, especially given our tendency for manipulation of the world. We know that this is how we got here. This is what makes humans really do well in the world. And if we look forward, right, our manipulation has gotten into the level of the genome, has gotten to the level of physiologies, and so moving forward, when we think about creating new spaces and ecologies for pathogens, well, what does the future hold? I'll just leave you with a couple of images to stare at for a moment. Thank you.